Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host, and Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing well, doing
Good,
well.
good.
Guess what we're going to talk about today? You'd have never guessed, but you're prepared. I do know that.
I hope so.
We're going to talk about foreign policy as usual, and we're going to be talking about the needless wars that we get involved in, and there's going to be a discussion on the House floor today,
yes,
which we consider important, even though it's not going to be dramatic as to stop all wars and prevent our presidents, today's president, future's president, and never prevented the past presidents from pursuing war to the different countries. We've been in the Middle East essentially since 9/11. Yeah. But there's two amendments coming up, and it's interesting. They want to put the amendments on a bill for a gold medal for what was it? It was a gold medal presented for one of the military organizations, but it was an irrelevant medal, but they're going to attach it. Republicans got mad. Oh, you're putting an amendment on a piece of legislation. We want to pass this bill, but of course they do that all the time. Yeah, this is what's happening. It's a minor bill that's on the floor, but they're going to have two amendments, and it's more or less Iran is the object of these. One is to prevent any funding to pursue war in Iran, and also to repeal the so-called authority to use military force, which is open-ended, which was a bill that we tried hard to prevent, and that was back, it was passed in 2002, and it authorized the Iraqi war. Yeah. And I imagine if you look back, especially over the last decade or two, that bill is probably the one I worked hardest on. I probably gave more speeches on and complained more. But anyway, they passed that authority, but they used this authority to go to Iraq. Now, and they've used it for other things too, and now they're using it, Trump would use it to go after Iran. Yeah. Now, Trump is opposed to these things that seem to rein in executive power, and it seems that all presidents like it, even if they're against war, of course. They don't want any restrictions. Remember, the War Powers Resolution was passed in 1973 or so, and that was seen. It was vetoed and still passed, and that was to rein in the warmongering that gave us the Vietnam War. Yeah. So there's been a lot of resolutions like this. So these are two bills that are coming up, and one is my kind of bill, and we'll mention that, of course. It's about a sentence or two. It's one sheet of paper, and I wanted to pass a rule in the House one time that if we were acting properly and we were concerned, we would probably have a rule: bills no longer than one page, and the only thing you can do is improve the conditions of the country by repealing laws and not adding anything new. So that one is pretty easy to understand. But the other one is a little more difficult because it has good intention, but it has bad publicity on bad PR, bad propaganda that makes us very hesitant to endorse.
Yeah, that's true, and we can get into that. But on the issue of the impropriety of attaching it to the gold medal bill, well, they had every opportunity to do it properly then. These were two amendments that were initially attached to the NDAA, if you remember, for 2020, and they could have easily and appropriately been debated within the context of that bill. But of course, the managers, as they always do, they'll get in there and they just ripped them out, I think in conference, if I'm not mistaken, but they were ripped out of the bill. So that's why we're dealing with them today, but they'll both be debated and voted on the House floor. And the first one that you said rightly that you thought was a good one was Barbara Lee's bill. And you've worked with Barbara Lee, and I've worked with her staff for years and years, and they've always been very helpful and very cooperative and very friendly to us. But it is a very clean bill, as you point out, simply repealing the O2 authorization to attack Iraq. And it should be a no-brainer, and it should have been done a long time ago when we first realized, or when even the neocons realized, that the war was a lie. Everything in the bill was a lie. Everything about it was a lie. It should have been instantly repealed. But nevertheless, as you say, Trump has used it, Obama has used it. They've all used it as an excuse for warmongering without the authorization. I think Trump as recently as the assassination of Soleimani used the O2 authorization. So that one I think should be an easy one to pass. And Trump, even according to one article I read, he said he had no opposition to the repeal of that. We'll see, though, when it comes down to the wire, if it passes.
You know, the real irony here is they're looking for the proper legislative answer to us getting too much involved in war, and yet we have the best prohibition, and that happens to be in the Constitution, you know. And, you know, I think back about the history of the early history of our country, because early on, and I certainly think maybe too often, even Jefferson decided to use force. And but very reservedly. He didn't just go and then announce and demand that they pay for and all this, because he was fighting the Barbary pirates, and they wanted to show that a new country shouldn't be pushed around the high seas. So he would go out and use force, but every time he did something, he either had to report it or get permission, but it was very much in the open. So he respected this, but even though there was a little bit more than I might like to have seen, because it did grow over the years, and now it's always almost sacred. Trump's position on this is, if you pass this restriction on me, you're more likely to have war.
Yeah.
Now what do you mean? You're more likely to have war if we put restrictions on letting you go to war. And the way I understand his concerns is that he will be restrained in doing little wars. Use of, to me, using aggression against the country. How do we do that? We put on sanctions. We assassinate leaders. We put tariffs on people, all kinds of weapons, and we occupy countries. And believe it or not, and you'll probably believe me, that we as a country has been very often with our CIA involved in elections in other countries. And, you know, today nobody would ever dare get involved in election. But we do it routinely.
Yeah.
But that would restrain the president. Trump's arguing that would restrain the presidency, the executive power, but it would also restrain the CIA, which is what we really ought to be doing.
Yeah, that is a great point that you brought up, his disagreement with it. That it would make war more likely because it ties his hands. But this is talk about hubris, because what this does, this represents the false notion that all of his limited strikes and all the things like the assassination, like these when he lobs a few missiles into the desert, these presuppose that those are not leading us toward a path to war. And whereas I think that the neocons know very well what they're doing when they're telling Trump, and we know that David Worms, we talked about the other day, he was the author of this big idea that, hey, take out Soleimani, the Iranian people are going to be dancing in the streets and overthrowing their government. Of course, it's a lie. If anything, it galvanized them against the U.S. and the Iraqis against the U.S. But this false idea that he has, that this continued ramping up of military actions short of all-out war, what is all-out war, that somehow is not leading us down the path to war, which I think it is.
And especially in this age where war is not going to be World War II type war. It's going to be very modernized, and it's going to be cyber wars, all kinds of things going on. So it's the only way the old principle that we follow, and a lot of people still do, is the line should be drawn sharply. If it's conceived to be the use of force against somebody else, and not in defense but aggressively used, you shouldn't do it. Yeah. You know, whether it's the type of aggression that they already use, or the old fight type of aggression, because they still do that. We still have troops around. And one argument that Trump made was, I don't know why they want me to hurry up and get out of Iraq and things, because I'm leaving. But yeah, we were told he was leaving Syria, except for he was going to leave Afghanistan, except we need more troops in there. In the same way, preparation for Iran, the big battle, it seems like we're preparing for, not only the electronic and cyber type of battle, but actually a lot of troops. I mean, when you look at total statistics of how many people we've moved into the Middle East and how many bases we have around there, and literally it's surrounding Iran. So they're the bad guys, and they live in fear and intimidation. And you know, then there's the challenge. Well, they're terrorists. We have to do this. But I wonder if there's anybody you could find in Iraq or any of those countries, especially Iran right now, whether they feel like they're victims of terrorism. I mean, people, when bombs get dropped on them, that to me is pretty terroristic, I would think.
Or when you're going to a wedding party and they all get blown up. But a more problematic one is the one introduced by Ro Khanna from California, and I think you characterize him correctly, that probably his heart is in the right place, and he's done some good things. But unfortunately, the bill, and it's originally H.R. 5543, I think is counterproductive. And I think it's because of the whereas clauses. And usually, your role always was, well, the whereas clauses aren't that important if the actual construction is solid. In this case, and I think you said that you probably wouldn't vote for it, the whereas clause are so bad that actually, if these statements of fact are indeed fact, I think it's a good argument to go to war with Iran. and here's a couple of, and I'll just go through both of them. The first one, the acquisition by the government of Iran of a nuclear weapon would pose a grave threat to international peace, stability, and the national security of the United States and U.S. allies, including Israel. Well, think about what that really means. Why is it in there in the first place? The second place, that lays out the conditions under which war would be justified with Iran. That's essentially what it does. It does the opposite of what it proposes to do. And if you think about that, this is saying basically, hey, war with Iran is probably okay if they're making a nuclear weapon. And then consider that along with the propaganda of the neocons, of Netanyahu, of everyone who said that Iran is 3 days away from a nuclear weapon. So those two working together, I think, are very, very dangerous, and I think it was very unwise of him to include that first part.
And I just wonder how that came about. And you even, thought about, what if we'd been there, because maybe we could talk with people like this and they might modify. But this is a propaganda piece, is what it is. And he has the opportunity. So I really would like to know more about his motives and why he does this, because I think it's a propaganda stunt, to get people willing to support the war. And this is a tool that they use, because you could argue, the amendment probably isn't going to get passed, but they're going to get to talk about how bad. How bad it is, and even the people who want to come home, look at what they're saying. We can't walk away from that. So this is, I think, it's a propaganda piece, and yet it does say that why are we doing this, and we shouldn't start a war with Iran.
Yeah, it is. And the second whereas clause, I think, is just as troubling, because it starts out by saying the government of Iran is a leading state sponsor of terrorism. Wow. I mean, if that's the case, then maybe we should go to war with him. If they're going around the world blowing things up and killing people willy-nilly, we might be next. So that is actually an argument in favor of that. And you brought this up, I'm going to steal your great comment from before the show, under the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, just designating this, just calling them a terroristic country, just saying they're a terrorist sponsor, that opens them up to the use of force under the AUMF. So it's almost, in a way, authorizing force by reinforcing that notion.
Yeah, that's why all these efforts to authorize force, when we do have a definition of when the president can use force and start a war, and of course that's the Constitution. But they don't want that. The presidents don't want restraint. The military-industrial complex don't want restraint, and the people who aren't U.S. sovereignty oriented, and they do believe in the empire, which means most of the Republicans and Democrats. All these authority to use military force are very dangerous. And you bring up this subject because it was a bill that I voted for, and the bill, as I saw it, I remember saying, this is not perfect, but under these circumstances, of 9/11, something's going on. 3,000 Americans were killed by what appeared to be outsiders, and the president ought to have authority to respond. So, I voted for that, but it was to go after the people who participated. It's pretty explicit.
Yeah.
You had to have participated in the 9/11 attacks. But now what they have done is they've turned that into terrorism.
Yeah.
Anything that's terrorism is authorized, and terrorism is this vague thing called a tactic. So that's open-ended, and that's why it's been used. That's why, assassinating a leader of another country when he's visiting another country. Oh yeah, he's part of the 9/11, and I don't even know how old he is, but he probably wasn't all that involved in 9/11. So it's a shame, but this is the power. It's like a cancer.
Yeah.
Once they get the power, they never back off. Politicians never back off. And Republican or Democrat, they always cling to power. Then anybody who endorses this power, in the leadership, you usually can't get in leadership unless you endorse this principle. And that's why it just it grows and grows until the country finally overextends itself, and empires always end. And we're approaching that. And I think these are some of the examples of what happened. There's such resistance to that. But even though we're critical of some of this and what's going on, I think it's good that there's a debate going on. At least I don't expect all of a sudden, okay, the president say, you guys are right. We need to come home. We need to really come home. We won't just pretend to come home. We're coming home. But no, that's not going to happen. But the discussion out there, and we're running into more organizations now around the country, including military people, who say it's time to come home. They're using the language that we've used for years. So that I think is good.
Very positive. And the other part and I don't want to beat this to death, but I think it's important to mention the other part in the Bill of Particulars against Iran in Ro Khanna's bill is Iran is terrible because, quote, they continue to materially support the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. What does that mean? Why does that make them terrible people? If you look at it doesn't mean we're saying Assad is a wonderful guy. What they do to support Assad is they fought with him against ISIS and Al Qaeda. That's what they did. They and the Russians came in 2015 and defeated ISIS and Al Qaeda. So why are we complaining about this then? We should be celebrating. We should be happy. And certainly Assad is not going to come attack us. He's got his own worries to deal with. So, words are important. Words have meaning. And he may have thought he was throwing us off to some conservatives to get them on board by saying these kind of tough guy things. But in fact, it's having the opposite effect. And I think there's some dangerous poison pills in this bill.
Yeah. And, there was a bill passed that would restrain what is going on with Iran under the War Powers Resolution, and it passed the House. But it's still not a worry for the establishment, because it didn't go to the Senate, and a president would veto it. So that's not going to happen. So that's why you have to change a whole attitude, an attitude of the people. And you have to get people who are more respectful of law and order and the law of the land. And this is the most difficult because people consider this too tedious, and we have to have rapid responses and on and on. And matter of fact, the Constitution does even protect rapid response. If 9/11 was occurring with aircraft carriers and the troops were landing, they don't have to wait to the time to the Congress assembles. An actual imminent attack is permissible, but that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about any of that to go 6,000 miles away, spend close to $7,000, kill 1 million people. At the same time, thousands of Americans are injured, and things are worse there than ever.
Yeah.
So these are very token efforts, but they're worthwhile to pursue. But we also should have the responsibility of pointing out, well, don't we have to be involved? I mean, there's a lot of bad people out there, and of course, we make that point all the time: is that we make things worse, not better, and we can practice what we preach, and people someday may look at what we're doing.
Yeah, we can hope. Well, I would just conclude by saying, obviously, I agree with Dr. Paul, and he makes a great point about, I've been critical of Ro Khanna's bill specifically for these couple of poison pills. However, I think overall it is a positive, even if Dr. Paul wouldn't vote for it, and I'd agree with him on it, because it's incrementalism in the right direction. And Dr. Paul always talks about how in 1998, when they passed the first Iraqi Freedom Act, what they were trying to do was establish facts, frame the issue, frame the debate, establish that he's a bad guy, and keep going and going. And that's what they did. They established a baseline, and then they build on it, and they build on it, and they build on it until the only conclusion is war. And so this, I think, is incrementalism in the opposite direction, in the right direction. And I think the other side understands the value of this, and our side should understand that as well. We need to start establishing the facts that the president shouldn't go to war with Iran, that period, but certainly should get authorization. So in that respect, any debate they're having on limiting the authority or even on the futility of the foolishness of going to war with Iran is a positive. So despite our kind of a little bit of gloom, at the end of the day, it is a good news story that they're talking about it today.
Very good. And I remember the debate in 98 because there is a process in the House that if both sides agree on a bill and they suspend the rules, that if you oppose it, you can get the opposition time. And both Republicans and Democrats, this was benign. It was just to point out the evils of Saddam Hussein. And I did say, I think it's explicit, that if you pass things like this will end up in a war, against Iraq. And lo and behold, we did end up with a war. There's one other thing that Daniel talks about, and he had the experience of working with other offices, and I always enjoyed working with honest progressives, and a person like Dennis Kucinich became a good friend, and yet we had our disagreements. But philosophically, there's a disagreement that we have with some of the people that are in the anti-war position, but it can be a friendly disagreement. Because in a way I give them an inch, and that is progressives who are really against war, you work with, but their ultimate goals are a little bit different because they figure, well, if we save a lot of money going overseas, which is a really good idea, and try to prevent wars, more money can be used for the welfare state. And that is better to me than continuing the wars. But the whole thing is our position is you stop the wars and stop the spending and get rid of the military-industrial complex, there will be more money left in this country. Put more money into people's pockets, and the welfareism of all Americans would be improved. But that's just a little tidbit, but it allows me to at least talk with people who have agreements with us on the war, but maybe not on how we're supposed to get health care for everybody. But anyway, I think this is a very important discussion, and I imagine by the end of the day you can check and see how the votes came out on the House floor. I think the importance of the debate is only the idea of getting people's attention on the problems, because the votes will not change our foreign policy today. But let's hope the continuation of these kinds of debates will eventually change our foreign policy to that of design for peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.